of the SecDev group, where he leads its geopolitical digital risk practice. He's also a senior fellow with Canada's Centre for International Governance Innovation and has previously held appointments at University of Cambridge, International Institute for Strategic Studies, the Monk School of Global Affairs, and the International Development Research Centre, among others. His work in the field of cybersecurity and digital violent extremism is informed by over 2 decades of experience in working in over 37 countries with the United Nations, World Bank, and other international organizations. Over to you, Rafal.
Great, thank you, and good morning, everybody. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be able to present to you today on a topic which I think is both interesting in terms of what it says about the region and its stability, but also impacts on the broader question of democratic decline and the rise of smart cities and surveillance as a threshold for crossing over into a digital authoritarianism. As was already said earlier by Alistair, our work, SecDev's work in Central Asia, stretches back almost 2 decades. Initially working with the UN and the World Bank, helping to put in place some of the information infrastructures which paradoxically make digital extremism as well as digital transformation possible. But later also working with funding from the US State Department Internet Freedom Program with groups of lawyers, civil society, and government to try to come up with a governance roadmap for this fast changing digital environment within the region. SecDev is a boutique digital risk consultancy. We use data, maps, and innovative approaches to social science in order to excavate and find insights into challenging problems. And perhaps no other problem is more challenging today than the intersection between technological change and social and political change propelled by technologies such as the internet, artificial intelligence, and, as we've seen in the last year, bioengineering. So it's my pleasure today to give you a bit of an insight onto a research cycle that we've now been conducting for well over 3 years that's focused on how the digital space has started to become colonized and leveraged by violent extremist actors. Like most of the world over the last decade, we've seen that civil society and non-civil society groups have taken advantage of the opportunities that cyberspace has brought for mass mobilization, propaganda, disinformation, and ultimately action. In Central Asia, this phenomenon has come at a time where states were already starting to grapple with the broader social implications of this technology, including how it affects the perceived political stability of its member states. This region also is unique in its geopolitical position, and as I will talk about in my talk, what happens in this region in terms of how states respond and how donors respond to the challenge of violent extremism is going to impact not just on the stability of the region, but also more broadly on questions of internet freedom and on democratic decline. So I'm going to share my screen and put up what will be a brief, hopefully, 25-minute presentation. And then we can perhaps move to some questions and answers around this topic. So I believe my screen is now visible. So for the most part of the 19th century, Central Asia was a centerpiece of a great game, a diplomatic confrontation between the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and Afghanistan over the neighboring territories of Central and South Asia. As we enter into the second decade of the 21st century, the region is once again becoming the center to a number of issues of both regional and global consequence. While we may not think of the 69 million people who make up this region as pivotal to the future of internet governance, of peace and security in Asia and Europe, as a tipping point between democracy and the rising tide of democratic digital authoritarianism, it is in fact this region in which many of these questions will be resolved, and in not such a distant future. In the next 20 or so minutes, I want to share with you some of the results of our ongoing study of digital transformation and digital violent extremism in the Central Asia region and its consequences for the region, as well as the world beyond. And in so doing, I'm going to cover 3 principal questions. The first is to give you a perspective on the scale, size, and scope and impact of digital violent extremism in Central Asia, drawn from the principal findings of our multi-year study, and to examine the phenomenon of digital transformation and digital violent extremism within the region. Second, I'll address why this issue is of concern and why we should care. Why does this region matter? And what are some of the consequences of inaction for the region and for the world, including the rise of digital authoritarianism? And lastly, I want to leave you with some thoughts on what strategic and practical steps we can take to address and reduce the risk of digital violent extremism, and at the same time lessen the reflexive action towards adopting repressive digital authoritarianism as a means of combating potential and perceived online harms. The Central Asia region, like most regions of the world, is undergoing a fundamental digital transformation. The cumulative global impact of this transformation is deep and significant. By most estimates, by 2025 and beyond, approximately 18 to 25% of global GDP will be dependent upon the global digital economy. Digital transformation is a central theme in the national development strategies of the Central Asian countries. On average, more than 2/3 of the region's 69 million people are online with social media, and mobile broadband usage is growing at rates of 31% annually. The region is also young, with a mean age of roughly 26 years of age. This maps favorably with new digital generation, 2/3 of which, globally, is under 35. Digital transformation is also a central theme in the national development strategies of Central Asian countries. Presently, over half the population of this region are going to be using these technologies, supplanting newspapers and television as a principal source of information for these newly connected demographics. The digitization of the region is supported by multilateral donors such as the World Bank and through investment in the region by global, but especially Russian and Chinese companies. The emergence of the digital economy and nascent digital society has opened new economic benefits and opportunities. But as we are quickly learning, information technologies do not discriminate and offer the same opportunities to cyber criminals and to terrorists as they do for digital government, e-learning, digital entrepreneurship. In the interest of time, let me briefly summarize the key 3 findings or trends that we've had in our study. The first finding is that digital violent extremism community in Central Asia is small and has largely not changed over the 2 years that we've been observing it. There are reasons for this that will become evident in a moment. Second, the core channels that make up the digital violent extremist ecosystem are largely echo chambers and have limited appeal. A narrative analysis of the conversations over the last 2 years indicate that most speak to those who are already believers and focus on topics and narratives that are only of interest to that community. And third, despite their limited appeal, these VE groups are resilient and have managed to maintain the same audience despite repeated attempts to remove their contents and channel and other means for taking them offline. More ominously, the tactics used by these groups are changing, including the shifting their focus of their messaging to mainstream issues such as the role of religion in society. Now, there are good news and there are not so good news in these findings. First, the good news. The rate at which violent extremist groups have grown online is not out of step with the overall growth of users in the region. That is to say, the absolute percentage is relatively stable, likely indicating that the appeal of these groups and their messaging is limited to a group which is growing, but not out of step with the general demographic going online. In this respect, violent extremism is no different than any other social phenomenon and should be seen as a normal part of the social spectrum rather than something exceptional or unusual. This means that addressing it does not require exceptional means, but rather could be done through a public health approach focusing on reducing risk factors, raising protective factors such as digital literacy and social engagement, and, where necessary, through the application of the justice system. This approach has some distinct advantages over a policing-led approach that tends to have the opposite effect, reinforcing VE narratives of oppression and often increasing the popularity of violent extremist content and channels. The not so good news is that violent extremism is likely a persistent feature of online life in Central Asia. The continuing conflict in Afghanistan, the People's Republics of China's current policies in Xinjiang province, and the conflict in Syria and Iraq represent risk factors that sustain the appeal of violent extremist narratives by stoking grievances and reinforcing stereotypes. So let's now briefly turn to what the landscape of violent extremism looks like in Central Asia. During our research in 2020, we've identified over 1,275 active and dormant channels across 9 social media platforms. At least 720 of these channels are overseen by 13 regional and international violent extremist groups. But 3 violent extremist groups, Islamic State, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, and Tahvid va Jihad Katbasi, TJK, contribute to over 77% of all active and blocked channels and 70% overall of all channels active in this way. For the most part, these groups have adapted to the frequent takedowns of content by major social media platforms such as Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, as well as the Russian language platforms VK and OK, Vkontakte, Odnoklassniki. They are also aware that social media channels are subject to surveillance by intelligence agencies, and as a result, in all cases, apply a high degree of tradecraft to how they use the platforms and prepare themselves for the inevitable takedowns of content as social media platforms and government have started to work together to address the problem of violent extremism online. As a result, oops, I'm just going back here. As a result, the platforms preferred by Central Asian VE actors include Telegram and Instagram, which are more popular than other social media platforms. In fact, approximately 72% of all channels, VE channels, and 60% of all subscriptions to those channels that we monitored during our research were connected to the Telegram platform in one way or the other. But to be clear, VE, violent extremism, is not a Telegram problem. In 2019 and 2020, Telegram aggressively took down violent extremist channels. The reason VE groups appear to use Telegram is because of its popularity within the region and not just its general accessibility, which means if it was another platform, we would see exactly the same kind of results. More recently, we've seen that violent extremist groups are experimenting with a wider range of new and smaller platforms, including TikTok, which is growing very rapidly within the region. Language is also an important criteria to understanding the violent extremism ecosystem. Russian continues to dominate. Over 80% of subscriptions are to channels that operate exclusively in the Russian language. Of the other languages, Uzbek is the second most frequently found, with approximately 15% of subscriptions. Tajik, Kazakh, and Kyrgyz, the remainder of the languages, and Turkmen are relatively rare and certainly below the percentages of internet and social media users represented by the demographic size of these communities in Central Asia. The linguistic features of violent extremist communities in Central Asia may be explainable by the content of the VE channels. To date, most narratives tend to focus on internationalized calls for action and are linked to global rather than local events. In particular, depictions of organized violence connected to active conflict in Afghanistan and to a lesser extent Iraq and Syria still tend to dominate over references to local dynamics in the region, including the recent turnover of authority in Kyrgyzstan and the border clashes that we saw last week between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. In fact, in the last 6 months of observation, the discussion of events in France and Russia were more frequent than those of any events in Central Asian countries on these VE channels. So if the appeal of violent extremist groups is so narrow, why have they continued to grow? In part, this can be explained both by tactical and strategic considerations that presumably drive the online actions of these groups. At a tactical level, violent extremist groups have been largely driven off mainstream social media platforms through the coordinated efforts of companies such as Facebook, Google, and Twitter, working through the GIFTC, a mechanism initially set up under the auspices of the United Nations Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, and now self-managed by the social media platforms themselves. Content takedown has become faster, more accurate, and targeted. It's deprived groups such as Islamic State of a powerful propaganda mechanism that they had grown used to just a few years prior. This may have led to a strategic pivot in the way that these groups are now using social media. What we have observed is that violent extremist groups deliberately propagate content which is meant to address socially conservative audiences rather than those that may be interested in being mobilized by violence to calls for action in Afghanistan, Syria, and elsewhere. The core audience, The core audience for those subscribing to violent extremist content is quite small, in the range of approximately 184,000 subscriptions, or 3% of the 5.6 subscriptions to VE channels overall. But upwards of 50% of content generated by violent extremist actors is not violent at all, but rather increasingly targeting socially conservative issues. That content sees a much greater range of propagation, reaching upwards of 5.4 million subscribers, or 95.7% of the total, by way of what we call amplifier accounts and communities of interest. It's important to understand the mechanism by which violent extremists interact with these amplifier networks and what we call communities of interests. As mentioned earlier, for the most part, violent extremist groups are echo chambers that tend to stick to content which is of interest only to very small constituency. However, by also generating content that addresses social conservatism, the role of religion in society, the search for identity, that content is amplified through unrelated social media accounts and eventually reaches larger community groups that are interested in these latter issues. For individuals within these larger communities of interest, they may be unaware that the originating content came from a violent extremist group or account. But by following that content back to its point of origination, it serves as a mechanism for drawing people out of the community of interest and into the smaller echo chamber communities that the violent extremist channels represent. The degree to which individuals that are drawn this way and that remain within violent extremist channels is difficult to measure or ascertain. From our perspective, and from the perspective of our research over the past 12 months, this does not seem to be a successful mechanism for recruiting new converts to violent extremism, but it certainly does draw larger audiences. By posting content through amplifier networks into larger communities of interest, the violent extremist groups are creating a mechanism for being able to move their own constituency around, especially when channels are taken down or blocked by official social media platforms. In this respect, the relationship between violent extremist channels, larger communities of interest, serves at least two important roles. The first is that it preserves the presence of violent extremist groups online by creating a mechanism for them to transition their users between blocked channels and new channels. And secondly, it acts to mainstream violent extremist groups into legitimate discussions of religion and Islam and everyday life, which has the effect of shifting these discourses to accept or at least not reject the position put forward by violent extremist groups. In a way, it's analogous to the widening and shifting of the Overton window that's been discussed with respect to violent extremist groups in North America and in Europe. This, of course, raises the question of what is to be done, and what I'll be returning to later in my presentation. But I want to briefly reflect on what we have learned about how violent extremist actors have responded to attempts to remove and take down their content, just so we have a proper perspective on exactly how that's done. If 2020 is to be taken as a representative year, then the absolute number of violent extremist subscriptions was not reduced as a result of content takedown and moderation. In fact, leveraging a number of strategies, including this engagement with communities of interest, violent extremist groups were able to overcome the impact of blocking channels and removing their content, and to continue to grow their constituencies at a regular pace. What this tells us is that simply removing or blocking these groups is not sufficient to reduce their influence, and that the solution is not going to be found simply by better policing of platforms and cyberspace. Which leads me to the second point of my presentation, which is why we should care. The post-Soviet transition has not been kind to Central Asia. The region is a mosaic of nationalities and countries drawn at the whim of Stalin's pen. At independence in the early 90s, none of the countries of the regions corresponded to the traditional linguistic cultural boundaries of their communities. Instead, the former Soviet republics became independent countries, each of which was left with the task of defining its national identity and its sense of purpose. What endured from the Soviet legacy was an ideology that was principally built on development that could be achieved through science and through technology. As a result, and at various paces, the countries of Central Asia have linked their national development to technology-driven development, and in the last decade, to digital development. And therein lies the dilemma for Central Asian countries. Increasingly, the internet has become a key driver of economic empowerment. But like elsewhere, it has also become a mechanism for empowerment of all of society, including youth, students, business leaders, and members of the newly digitally connected populations, which include those espousing violent extremist views. This has left the countries in the region quite literally between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, countries are compelled to push their populations further online in order to further economic progress, while at the same time seeking stability by adopting ever more restrictive practices to limit unwanted empowerment through content regulation, censorship, surveillance, which, for countries and economies of the size and diversity of Central Asia, are antithetical to the very goals of development and growth. Further complicating matters, the region sits between two major internet superpowers, Russia and China. And perhaps uniquely in the world, the countries of the region belong to 5 political and security alliances: the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States, and in particular its Anti-Terrorist Committee, and the OSCE. For countries of the region, this leads to a stark choice between adopting draconian practices of their larger neighbors that aim to create state surveillance societies as a means of staving off digital political challenge from within, and economic development and progress, which ultimately guarantees social and political stability. But unfortunately for Central Asia, stability is unlikely to occur in the near future, and is in fact likely to get worse. The secular authoritarianism espoused by the states of the region has driven largely moderate opposition to the brink of extinction. Where opposition has organized has been around socially conservative issues, the very place where radical groups, including violent extremist actors, have set up and colonized an ecosystem. With the withdrawal of NATO forces from Afghanistan, it's likely to lead to further conflict on the borderlands of the region. China's continuing oppression of the Uyghur population will also continue to drive grievances and serve as a powerful totem of mobilization against the perceived oppression of Muslims within the region. And Islam, moderate or otherwise, is really the only alternative to the secular authoritarianism, and which serves as the ideology for most states and regimes within the region. And as a result, the presence of moderate Islam online is likely to continue for the indefinite future, and is precisely where violent extremist groups are likely to colonize as they seek to evade measures to take them offline. Addressing violent extremism in the region is therefore not just an issue of creating alternative narratives and ideologies of religiously motivated violence. Instead, the challenge is more significant, finding and striking a balance between addressing the risks of violent extremism while at the same time preserving the space for other alternative political options to emerge within the region. The alternative, of course, is the aforementioned knee-jerk reaction by governments in the region to adopt forms of digital authoritarianism that are presently being exported by China and Russia in the form of surveillance technologies and model laws curtailing online activity and access to content. In the short term, the dangers this represents is one of a closing of the internet commons by the states of the region and a contribution to the rising tide of ever more restrictive practices on the internet in support of authoritarian states. In the longer term, as we have seen, the digital violent extremist ecosystem is likely to persist because of the range of controls available to Central Asian countries are neither as pervasive nor as uniformly applicable as they are in neighboring China, mostly because of the fact that this area is such a political mosaic. Consequently, we can expect that repressive measures will be only partially successful. And if states expand the censorship practices to the socially conservative issues that violent extremist actors have moved to embrace, they will in fact spark greater opposition to the state and in turn bringing greater instability to this already volatile region. Which leads me to the last topic of this presentation, which is what can be done. This is not an easy question, but one that requires both strategic and practical thinking. At the strategic level, there needs to be a recognition that investment into addressing digital violent extremism in Central Asia is intertwined with the future of governance and the region's geostrategic stability for at least the next decade. Addressing digital violent extremism in isolation of these broader political and regional factors is unlikely to bring any desired result. Instead, as I've argued, it's likely to push the region towards greater digital authoritarianism and as a result, more volatility and instability as that strategy inevitably fails. Reducing the risk of violent extremism and its potential for destabilization requires a different approach, one which seeks to rapid normalization of how countries deal with their rapidly digitizing populations. In many ways, the very same dilemma that we are dealing with domestically in our advanced digitally connected societies. Bilateral and multilateral donors should encourage governments of the region to double down on digital transformation by investing into digital literacy and a public health approach to addressing or at least framing online harms in means other than simply policing. This means focusing on risk factors that underpin digital violent extremism and other online harms, and applying proven public health principles that include identifying risks, protective factors, and designing interventions that can be measured and repeated to manage and reduce overall levels of harm. For social media platforms, that means stepping up their engagement in Central Asia. Today, few platforms have maintained an active dialogue with governments in the region. This needs to change. And engagement needs to be more than just coordinated action to take down content. As COVID has shown us, social media platforms are also powerful mechanisms for public learning and to help build better understanding of digital safety and of digital harms. By leveraging the power of these platforms as vehicles for education and digital safety and hygiene training, it will reduce risks by addressing the vulnerability of populations to extremist content to begin with. As we've understood from other public health interventions, focus on risk and protective factors is important and effective, and these lessons should be applied in addressing online harms. Equally important is a recognition that gatekeepers play a significant role for young populations online. The internet has created new opportunities for directly accessing knowledge and information. This has been hugely empowering and important in the opportunities for economic gain that the digital economy represents. But at the same time, this direct access to information and knowledge has lowered the importance of family, schools, community groups, and independent media to act as arbitrators and interpreters of information. We recognize the role of these gatekeepers in other aspects of our life. For example, before we send our children to school, they learn the basics of social interaction, how to look both ways before they cross the road, how to behave with others from the family. Likewise, by attending school, being a member of a religious congregation or professional society, our understanding of knowledge as individuals is changed and shaped through interactions with others and through mentorship in a social setting. Gatekeepers need to be re-empowered to act as those mentors, to provide the needed guidance and to help young people finding their way online to make smarter choices and understand the risks as well as the opportunities of these online spaces. This is basic digital literacy. This is basic digital hygiene. But just like teaching your children to look both ways before crossing the street or to wash their hands before they eat, the impact on reducing risk is significant. It also builds better digital citizens, which is a key to avoiding the trap of digital authoritarianism. These are important considerations and important lessons for us to consider. In conclusion, violent extremism is present in all societies. It is part of the spectrum of human beliefs and activities. While it will never be fully eradicated from our new digital world, creating appropriate and diverse mechanisms in order to reduce risk and minimize impact are important. In Central Asia, digital violent extremism is present and persistent. Geopolitical factors such as the risk of renewed war in Afghanistan and the continuing oppression of Uyghur peoples in neighboring China will continue to act as a strong external stimulus for mobilization for these beliefs. But it's also important to recognize that digital violent extremism is present and persistent precisely because Central Asia is becoming more digital. Consequently, reducing the risks of violent extremism means addressing these risk factors that make these groups appealing. It means a greater investment into digital literacy among the young and also by empowering social gatekeepers. It means working with social media companies to develop new approaches to public education to reduce the opportunity for extremist messages for receptive eyes and ears. It means making the internet a much more sunny place. It also means working with governments in the region to create alternatives to digital authoritarianism as a means of addressing their fear of change and instability. And finally, it also means expanding our existing toolbox of approaches and means to measure the growth and impact of the digital ecosystem. Our study has revealed perhaps more questions than it has provided answers that require follow-up, foremost of which is the degree to which the VE ecosystem overlaps with this information and a means to prompt stronger controls in the region. The digital era will continue to throw up considerable challenges and opportunities. But finding the right balance between public policy, education, engagement, and policing will ensure that we can reap the benefits while minimizing the risks of our increasingly interdependent, connected, and digital world. On that, thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to a discussion. Thanks, Alistair.
Thank you very much for absolutely fascinating and in-depth presentation there, Rafal, and much food for thought and lots of questions for a discussion later. Quick reminder for everyone that the recorded part of this event will be ending now, and the rest of the event will be under Chatham House rules. Before we open up for discussion,